Okay, we're on part 2, Roots of Black Radicalism, chapter 6, Historical Archaeology of the Black Radical Tradition, Palmares and the 17th Century Marronage. This one's a little bit long, so I'm going to do my best not to ramble. In Brazil, which we have seen dominated the Portuguese slave trade, the Maroon settlements, quilombos, that began in the 16th century would extend into the next. Ernesto Enes, a scholar who was far from being in sympathy with the fugitives, nevertheless recorded in 1948 from his review of the documents in the Arquivo Histórico Colonial in Lisbon that he found traces in every corner of Brazil of quilombos. Arthur Ramos, summarizing his own studies of blacks in Brazil, declared, From the beginning of slavery, escapes were frequent. That's my brain right now, to me. Anyways, the escaped slaves, called locally quilombolas, often gathered together in organized groups, known in Brazil as quilombos. From the beginning, the owners complained of the frequent escapes of the slaves, demanding protection and security from the public authorities. Later, the situation was met by the employment of the bush captain and by notices in the press, publicizing the loss of the slaves and urging collective action for their recapture. That the slaves had good reason to be concerned for their liberty, despite bland suggestions from the scholars such as A.J.R. Russell Wood, that the only thing at issue was their adapting to a new diet, new environment, and new working conditions, is suggested by Stuart Schwartz. Consideration of the sugar industry in colonial Bahia. Added to the rigors inherent in the system of sugar production and to occasional acts of individual cruelty, slaves also suffered from a planned policy of punishment. What the heck? My skin's looking better, but girl, come on. Sorry. It's just like, when you see that? Like, do you see that? Anyways. Suffered from a planned policy of punishment and terror as a means of control. Think about that, like, right now. The policy, okay. Oh, I already made a note. It's where the pink one is. Plantation owners believed that only by severity could work be accomplished and discipline maintained, especially when the ratio in the fields was often 40 slaves to one white sharecropper or overseer. This sort of institutionalized brutality, when coupled with arduous labor, poor working conditions, and simple cruelty, contributed to the motivations for escape. And you would think people would look back in history and be like, these poor conditions, horrible environment, and brutality really does not make anyone want to be contributing members to society. But no, we're still living in our history. Conditions are still bad. We're pretty much on a global plantation. And now what? The hypermilitarization of the police, one, over policing, hyper surveillance, like, girl, it's like, as the community gets bigger and whatever, the cops are like bigger. Anyways, the work of Ramos, R.K. Kent, Irene Diggs, Donald Pearson, Edison Carino Schwartz, and Raimundo Nina Rodriguez indicates that for Brazil as a whole, from the 16th century into the late 19th century, slave resistance, rebellions, and conspiracies were constants in the land. In the 17th and 18th centuries, though, it was the Maroon settlements that dominated the reaction to slavery. indicates that for Brazil as a whole, from the 16th century to the late 19th century, slave resistance, rebellions, and conspiracies were constant in the land. In the 17th and 18th centuries, though, it was the maroon settlements that dominated the reaction to slavery. In the Pernambuco region, the greatest settlement of all, the extraordinary state of Palmares would endure from 1605 to 1695. And why don't they teach us about this? That's a long time. That's insane, actually. Palmares was a plural, designating the several settlements, Palmares, that would make up the community, which, though necessarily agrarian, was even more preoccupied with its defense. Diggs gives us this description. The site of the Quilombo of Os Palmares was a mountainous region, steep and precipitous, a natural defense of the inhabitants, but at the same time a virgin land whose exuberance was considered the best in the state of Pernambuco. The many fruit trees gave easy sustenance. And I'm pausing there for the part about food. And like I don't know if you've seen on TikTok, but there's so many videos, not so many, like a handful of videos that I've seen of cops destroying community gardens. Think about that connection right there. Right, because how are you going to be a cop? First of all, if I was a cop, I'd be so embarrassed. But how are you going to be a cop and be like, oh, okay, I'm just taking orders, but your orders are telling you to destroy a garden? Really? And you're proud of that? But that's it's... You're going to look in the mirror and be like, oh, I did good today? Did well, excuse me? Like, I would be so shameful. The many fruit trees gave easy sustenance to those who knew where they were. Timber-yielding trees served various industrial uses. Most important of all these trees was the Palmeira pindoba, the coconut palm, which provided excellent food and a delicious drink. In 1645, Bartholomew Lentes, acting as a scout for the expeditions that the Dutch were to mount against Palmeiras, was the first hostile European to discover that the state consisted of several settlements, 2 major Palmeiras of 5,000 inhabitants, and several small units including 6,000. By 1677, there were 10 major Palmeiras, one of which was the capital, Makoko, where the king Ganga Zumba from the Zanda signifying consensus ruler resided. The whole state spanning over 60 leagues. It was then estimated that the population numbered between 15,000 and 20,000, a mixture of Creoles and Africans largely drawn from the Angola-Congo regions. For almost a century, neither the Portuguese nor the interloper Dutch nor the Creole moradores could destroy it, though they tried for more than 70 years. Even in the end, between 1672 to 94, R.K. Kent tells us it withstood on the average 1 Portuguese expedition every 15 months. There was, however, one important political development during this period. In 1678, as he has done earlier, whenever a new governor came to Pernambuco, Ganga Zumba sued for peace. The treaty that was eventually signed, Kent quotes Nina Rodriguez, what's a transit update? Let me just turn that off. Kent quotes Nina Rodriguez. I don't think it's Rodriguez because there's a G in Rodriguez, right? Rodriguez. Rodriquez. Quez. Rodriguez. Nina Rodriguez. Okay, there we sound it out. Gave a real gave a real importance to the Negro state, which now the colony treated as one nation would another. The treaty, however, had little import for the morador, mor, moradores, who proceeded to claim and distribute among themselves a substantial portion of the Negro state. Ganga Zumba's authority was breached. By 1679, a Palmarista captain named Zumbi, whose uncle is Ganazona, was in revolt with João Mulato, Canhoga, Gaspar, and Amaro, having done the person of Ganga Zumba to death. By March 1680, Zambi was being called upon to surrender without success. The war was at once more. Zambi or Zumbi, according to Ramos, was already a well-known chief whose deeds amazed even the white soldiery. He would apparently reign as king in New Palmares until its end almost 2 decades later. But in his ascension to authority, it is possible to recognize that Ramos and others have described as the Bantu origins of Palmares. The perception of authentic authority is identical with secured social integrity was The perception of authentic authority as identical with secured social integrity was characteristically Central African. Palmares did fall, eventually in 1964, the result of campaigns launched by successive Portuguese governors of Pernambuco, João de Cunha Sotomayor, Marques de Montebello, and Melo de Castro. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm working on it. The last expedition sent against it consisted of nearly 3,000 men and was in the field for several months. The final siege was established on the 10th of November 1963 and lasted until early February of the following year. The total cost of the adventure was estimated by Melo de Castro at somewhere near 1,400,000 cruzados. On the night of on the 5th of February 1964, Zumbi, organizer of the defense of Palmares, having discovered that his position in Bariga Mountain had been nearly encircled, sought a last desperate chance to escape. The result was described by Colonel Domingos Jorge Velho, the leader of the Portuguese forces, and this is a quote, the next part, during the second watch of the night between the 5th and 6th of February, suddenly and tumultuously, Zumbi, with all of his people and the equipment which could follow him through that space, made an exit. The sentinels of the post did not perceive them almost until the end. In the rear guard, Zumbi himself was leaving, and at that point he was shot twice. As it was dark and all of this was taking place at the edge of the cliff, many, a matter of about 200, fell down the cliff. As many others were killed, both sexes and of all ages. 519 were taken prisoner. In Pernambuco, again, according to Governor Melo de Castro, this happy victory was regarded as no less important than the expulsion of the Dutch. It was, accordingly, celebrated by the whole population with displays of lights for 6 days and many other demonstrations of joy, without any command being given to them. Keeping in character, Enes attributed this excitement to the moral influence which it conferred to the authorities. See that? Okay, it's interesting. It's just, hold up. Excitement to the moral influence which was conferred on the authorities. Let's make sure I'm thinking about that word correctly. So they're saying that the moral influence that was bestowed upon to the authorities. Palmares, Ramos reminded us, was not, however, the only outstanding case. In 1650, the slaves in Rio de Janeiro organized a number of quilombos, which caused the police authorities of that region untold difficulties until suppressed by Captain Manole Jorado de Silvia. In the same century, the 17th century, the slaves of Jamaica joined the tradition of those in Brazil and Mexico. Barbara Kopitov had summarized these conditions. During the era of slavery, communities of Maroons or escaped slaves sprang upon throughout the New World. Wherever there were slave plantations, there was resistance in the form of runaways and slave revolts, and wherever mountains, swamps, or forests permitted the escaped slaves to gather they formed communities. Dang. These ranged in size from Palmares in Brazil, with over 10,000 people, to the handful of runaways who hid in the fringes of plantations in the American South. While most were destroyed, a few could not be reduced or even contained. The mid-century exploded with revolts on the island in 1669, 1672, twice, 1678, 1682, 1685, and 1690. In Jamaica, maroonage had begun during the period of Spanish colonization, from 1609 to 1655. And in the very last years of Spanish resistance, 1655 to 60, to British occupation of the island, at least 3 maroon camps played decisive roles in supporting the guerrilla campaign led by Cristobal de Yací against the British. Go black people. In the first month of 1660, however, the English made peace with one of the maroon chiefs, Juan de Bola, in parentheses, who promptly went to aid them in the destruction of, first, the remaining major maroon camps, and finally, Yací's guerrillas. Sellout. A little more than 3 years later, Juan de Bola met his appropriate fate. What reads like an official entry observed, on the first day of November, the outlying Negroes met with Juan de Bola and cut him to pieces. Good. Else all... my eye. Else all things were quite in the country. 300 years later, with an equal amount of sympathy, David... I don't know how to say his name. Bizarret and S.A.G. Taylor unhesitatingly estimated his death seems to us an act of justice. He was the great traitor. During the next 80 years, 2 major Maroon societies were formed in the highlands of Jamaica. One, the Windward Maroons, settling in the eastern mountains, had as its nucleus the Spanish Maroons and those who subsequently joined them from the English plantations and towns. This is low-key a long chapter, so I might split it. The others, the Leeward Maroons of the West Central Interior, came into being in 1673 after the first of the slave rebellions during English period. In 1690, another major rebellion, beginning in the Sutton Estate, added more than 200 refugees to the Leeward settlements complex. Such was the primary fashion in which the settlements grew and maintained themselves. The Maroon societies were formed, and their numbers increased, largely by slave rebellions and by individual and group escapes from the plantations. In addition, slaves were captured by Maroons during raids, and slave or free Negroes sent to fight the Maroons occasionally defected. Rebellions furnished the large numbers, as many as several hundred at a time, but rebellions were only one of a number of occasions for escape. There was a steady trickle of runaways, and the trickle became a stream whenever English punitive expeditions failed their purpose. Apparently, too, because of the low ratio of women to men, the Maroon communities were not yet self-reproducing. Though Akan speakers seem to have been dominant among these Jamaican Maroons, that's so cool! The political structure of the Leeward Maroons closely followed that found among the more Central African Palmaristas in Brazil. Cudjo, who became a dominant Leeward Maroon chieftain in the 1730s, employed a paramilitary organization that combined central authority with decentralized settlement. On the other hand, Kopitov notes, by the 1730s, the Maroons in the East had coalesced into a kind of cooperative federation in contrast. One clear distinction, though, between the Jamaican and Brazilian blacks was the presence of Obeja men and women, magical practitioners among the Windward and Leeward Maroons. To the masters, Obeja was simply witchcraft, detested both for its secrecy and its alleged skills in poisoning the enemies. Even to blacks, once assimilated, the assimilated black people. What the heck, eyelash? It's okay. Obeja, and think about that with hoodoo, root work, voodoo. Anything that's like an oppressed person's religion is evil. It's witchcraft. It's this. Or not even. Let's talk about the Salem witch trials when it was white women. My hair like to swing. Yeah. Hey, that. Even to the blacks, once assimilated, Obeja assumed a sinister aura because of its association with casting spells to cause harm as well as good. I like mixing my colors. To the unassimilated, on the other hand, Obeja was both a genuine religion and a potent source of medicine. Obeja, like the Haitian voodoo or the Jamaican variant Mayoism or Trinidadian Shango, sought ritualistic links with the spirit world beyond the shadows and the sacred trees, providing a mystical sense of continuity between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. Girl, and I got books for that. I got books for that too. This is one book, Jambalaya. I really like that one. There's so many, but that will be another topic, another day. But just know we're gonna put a pin in that, and that also connects to the black midwives in America. Miss Girl. Yeah, we got a lot to talk about. In Palmares, in keeping with the cosmology of Congolese and Angolan societies, magicians had been banned as, what's that word? Let me highlight that sentence though. But it threatened the king's authority. Girl. And what does it mean to get back to your roots? Hold up, I have so much to say about that. Oh, tending to obstruct or harm the king's authority. Highlight it. Because all of these practices were means of resistance for black people throughout the Americas and the Caribbeans and whatever. But Jambalaya even talks about the voodoo was the science of the oppressed, or the religion of the oppressed. Hold up. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is the book. Very, very good book. For black people only. I don't play that, like, you know. Voodoo is a science of the oppressed, a repository of woman knowledge, Mother Nature, the connection with the earth. Girl, don't get me started. It's really good, interesting to learn about the connections between African peoples throughout the diaspora and the manifestation of cosmologies and ideologies and culture. Like, think about the ways that drums are used throughout the African diaspora, and you know what I mean. But you could find like black people everywhere, girl. Anyways, among these peoples was most often the case that legitimacy of authority and the very existence of social order was concomitant to the eradication of sorcery and witchcraft. In the British West Indies, the elimination of obeah had become an official preoccupation. I have another good book. It's on my iPad. Black Magic by Yvonne Chareau, and she gets into the who, what, where, why, how of the demonization and criminalization. Dang, my elbow hurts. Girl, it hurts so bad. The criminalization of these practices, even midwives and doctors and stuff. Like, it's so interesting how like even white doctors went to black women to learn about pregnancy and birth giving and then criminalized their same practices. There's so much history. Wait, how many two? Oh, okay. Can we just get through this one? We don't have to split it up. We'll get through it. There's so much that I want to talk about. This part here can get me on a whole tangent, but we're gonna stop with the tangent, and for good reason. Obeah men and women were frequently the source of ideology for the slave rebellions. Obeah functioned largely in the numerous rebellions of the slaves. This was partially the case with the Obeah men from the Gold Coast. In the plotting of these rebellions, the Obeah man was essential to administering oaths of secrecy and, in cases, distributing fetishes which were supposed to immunize the insurgents from the arms of the whites. As it happened, Obeah proved to be more resilient than its opponents. Indeed, it never extinguished. It continued its mutational adaptation and development in Jamaica and elsewhere over the centuries, successfully manifesting itself in the societies of Maoism in the 18th and 19th centuries, the polka mania movement in the late 19th century, and the Rastafarians of the present. As we shall see, as it was with Obeah, it was also the case with marronage. Returning to the 17th century, the Palenques, Mocambos, and Quilombos, and maroon settlements that found sometimes tenuous, sometimes permanent existence in Mexico, Brazil, and Jamaica were replicated throughout the Spanish territories and the newer colonial possessions, marking the expansion of British, French, and Dutch merchant, agrarian, and bureaucratic interests. In Colombia, near the city of Cartagena, I don't know how to pronounce that. Sorry, I tried. A palenque known as San Bisayo was found at the beginning of the century. Earlier, in 1529 and 1550, revolts that occurred in the coast of this largely gold, sugar, and cacao-producing colony. But as the extractive industries moved further into the interior, and Colombia's demand for labor had made it a major importer of Africans, 200,000. Revolts and the establishment of refugee settlements became more frequent. Nevertheless, I don't know how to say this name. Guys, but that's so, like, think about, I never learned this in high school. I wonder, why am I oily? That's a good question. I actually just got out of the shower and put, like, lotion on. Ugh. But I don't want oil to be transferred to my book, so. But I think about how we weren't taught this information in high school or in, like, public education settings, and what does that do to, like, I think about what that does to someone's mind, and how we are miseducated Negroes. Shout out Carter G. Woodson. Anguirez Escalante tells us the most vigorous insurrections insurrectionist movement on the Caribbean coast of Colombia occurred in Cartagena de Indias in the beginning of the 17th century during the administration of Jeronimo Jeronimo de Sanzo Casarola. The fiery and daring Domingo Bijo was the first slave to revolt publicly. Claiming to have been the king of an African state, he plunged himself with 30 Negro men and women into the forests and the marshy areas of Matuna, south of the town of Tolu. Domingo, now known as King Bencos, put an end to the period of colonial tranquility in Cartagena, Tolu, Mompos, Tenerife, Tenerife, and so forth, by assaulting and robbing plantations, cattle ranches, cultivating farms, even canoes carrying fellow Negroes who had been sent to fell large trees for lumber. Okay. Took me a minute. I was like, what? Hello? Numerous expeditions against San Basilio failed, and in 1612 and 1613, a treaty that included amnesty was offered by the governor Diego Fernandez de Velasco. Many of the planqueros accepted the terms, which included the abandonment of the settlement. But in 1619, when other major slave revolts occurred in Cartagena, Route Mountains, oh my god, I was yelling. The occasion was seized by a subsequent governor to met out what he took to be a too long deferred revenge on the ex-rebellions. Escalante, however, insists Governor Garcia Garon uncovered a new plot by Bencos and captured him, and finally had him hanged. Still, descendants of the San Basilio Planque were to be encountered in the hinterlands as late as 1790. Not until the very last years of the 17th century, which is 1696, did the last of the period's major slave rebellions in Colombia take place. In Venezuela, the settlement of Nigra, I don't know, Nirgua, which Baron de Humboldt, Humboldt, apparently with some cynicism referred to as the Republic of Zambos and Mulattoes, was founded in similar circumstances in 1601. As such, it was in a direct line of descent from the rebellions that began in the colony in 1532 and again in 1555 with the establishment of the Barria Blanque associated with King Miguel. Venezuela, whose economy was a close replica of that of Colombia, would historically absorb a little bit more than half of the number of slaves, 121,000. However, for almost 300 years, Venezuela's Spanish settlement would have visited upon them the combined vengeances of black, mulattoes, Indians, and Zambos. In its highlands and valleys, which became the sites for rebellious Cumbes, the social basis of liberation movements became increasingly let me look up that word. Misingenuous? Oh, mixture of races. After, the social basis of liberation became increasingly mixed. After the 17th century, the same could be said of the towns that developed in close approximation to its ports and island markets. In the countryside, the forming peasantry became anarchic. As far as is known, no vision of an African state was ever associated with the flights or rebellions recorded in Venezuela. In the towns, something more akin to class wars became the rule, pitting free blacks, slaves, poor whites, mulattoes, zombos, and sometimes Ladino Indians against the Spanish ruling class. They said we're all in this together. Sorry. Perhaps another consequence of the girl. I think it's like the decrease, deracination. What deracination? Oh, ha, ha, ha. I knew the word. I mean, I knew the what.
Deracinated.
So deracination, meaning uprooted from one's natural geographical, social, or cultural environment. Perhaps another consequence of the deracination of blacks and Indians was that in the 18th and 19th centuries, Venezuela obtained a level of violence in its rebellions and reactions that was barely matched elsewhere in slave societies. Finally, in the British and French Guianas and Dutch Suriname, there occurred the most extraordinary instance of marronage, the formation of what in literature is rightly referred to as the Bush Negro tribes. And girl, okay, we're almost done with this. These people, the Saramaka Atawi, girl, and please mind my pronunciation, Kiwinti and the, oh my god, Dajuka, Aluku, and Peramaka. And I don't have to, it's too much time for me to like read those, like, constitute the most enduring and oldest examples of continuous marronage. They are people who, in the instance of Suriname, could be until quite recently in this century described as constituting a state within a state. Their history too begins in the 17th century, somewhere near its second quarter. Richard Price, one of the best informed students of these communities, had observed, for some 300 years, the Guianas had been the classic setting for Maroon communities. Though local Maroons in French and British Guyana were wiped out by the end of the 18th century, the Maroons of Suriname, known as Bush Negroes, have long been the hemisphere's largest Maroon population, except perhaps for Haiti. These have been the most highly developed independent societies and cultures in the history of Afro-America. Girl! Though the ancestries of these peoples are to be traced to the Windward, Gold, and Slave Coasts and the Longo/Angola, they fought and achieved a new identity, Bush Negro. This past demands attention. The conditions that produced the Maroon communities and ultimately the genesis of new peoples in the Guianas and Suriname were a product of a slave system in extremis. Its most important characteristics was that for African labor, Suriname became the most lethal colony in the New World. As Price remarks, the most striking feature of Suriname's demographic history is the extraordinary cost of its slave system on human lives. And R.D. Simmons exclaimed, We have seen some plantations swallow as many as 4 slave complements in a period of 25 years. The Dutch West Indies companies and their successors were hard-pressed to supply and resupply the colony's need for fresh African workers. Excuse me. Delish. Suriname's laboring population then, girl, I'm not talking to you, Siri, was constantly being revitalized biologically and, it turns out, culturally. In a colony where the ratio of blacks to white became as high as 25-1 in the 18th century, and its population maintained fewer than 10% Creoles in the first century, where labor was concentrated on large sugar, coffee, cacao, and cotton plantations, Price seems entirely justified in asserting that inter-African syncretism was almost everywhere the central process. We can assert with some confidence then that within the earliest decades of African presence in Suriname, I think it's Suriname, the core of a new language and a new religion had been developed. In the subsequent century of massive new importations from Africa apparently had the effect merely of leading to secondary elaborations. It was not long before the rainforests boldly defined the limits of cultivatable land became the bounds for resistance of an entirely different sort. Maroonage, of course, was a concomitant of slavery. Brutality was as much a raison, R-A-I-S-O-n, raison d'être. D-E with that thing, no, D apostrophe E with a caret, d'être as a former, as it was a condition of the latter. The English colonization of Suriname was of short duration, from 1651 to 1667, but even before the Dutch invasion of the colony and the Treaty of Breda, 1667, which formally succeeded it to them, Maroons had appeared. By the beginning of the 18th century, the Maroon population was estimated to have reached 5,000 to 6,000. Clearly an inflated figure, but indicative of a fear in which the colonists held the rebels. Extraordinary rewards were posted for the hunters of the liberationists, but even more, like, think about Asada, like the ways that rewards were, like bounties were put on their heads. And Angela, but even more remarkable are the rewards that became customary for Maroons. Price cites an early 1718 contemporary report. If a slave runs away into a forest in order to evade work for a few weeks, upon his being captured, his Achilles tendon is removed for the first offense. While for the second offense, if he wishes to increase the punishment, his right leg is amputated in order to stop him from running away. I myself was a witness to slaves being punished thus. Dang. Others were whipped to death with what was called a spanzaboc, a Spanish whip, or quartered alive, burned alive, decapitated, impaled. Trigger warning. Decapitated, impaled with a meat hook, or broken on scaffolds. Price argues that the multiplicity of travelers' accounts and local reports attesting to the unusual brutality of the Suriname planters of both Dutch and Portuguese Jewish origins fully substantiated that most practices were neither isolated nor unofficial. The colony's judiciary was often as brutal as the individual planters. The report of the English mercenaries, Captain J.G. Stedman, and then this is like his report, the narrative of a 5-year expedition against the revolted Negroes of Suriname and Guyana on the wild coast of South America from the year 1772 to 77, published in 1796, is a classic and authentic account of a starkly brutal slave society. Price concludes, all in all, the excesses of colonial Suriname, in terms of both the brutality and the luxury amid which the planters lived, must be constantly kept in mind in building towards some understanding of the slave's response. Meaning you have to understand the oppressive brutality enacted against them to understand why enslaved people took the risk. Okay, yeah, sorry, I was just working that out in my head. Thus were the beginnings of the bush Negroes of that land, the oldest being the Saramaka people. And at the end of the 18th century, more than 5 decades of intensive warfare, they achieved formal peace. But perhaps the last word should be one of their own. In 1885, Johannes King recalled from the oral tradition of his people. And this is his quote. The story of our forefathers honored God and their early ancestors when they came to receive the presents presented by the government of the bush Negroes as a confirmation of peace treaties and then returned to their villages. When they got back safely to their villages, they fired many salutes for the people who had waited at home. These people came to the bank of the river singing to escort them to shore. They played drums, danced, blew African trumpets, and sang, danced, and celebrated the whole afternoon until nighttime and the whole night until morning, and they played drums so. When they were finished, they would bring a bush drink that they made from sugarcane juice and which is called bush rum. They would pour a libation on the ground. That was in order to give thanks to the god and the ancestors. After that, they would play for the obejas and for the other gods that had helped them fight. The struggle that had begun in the 17th century had met its fruition among these African peoples far from the land of their ancestors. Period. Make a little note because I really like that part. And then Black resistance in North America. Per